This is a seminar for Module D, Unit 1, Lesson 2. The topic is roles in energy transfer. So today we'll be looking at some information that you will need to complete the food web portion of your Biome project. Chemical energy is stored in the food that organisms eat. In physical science, we talked about this concept last year. So you know that food contains stored chemical energy, and because the law of conservation of energy tells us that energy isn't created or destroyed, it just changes forms. We know that the body is able to take that stored chemical energy and change it into energy that it needs and can use for things like movement and other bodily processes. Producers are organisms that make food using light energy from the sun. So we're talking about things like plants that go through the process of photosynthesis. They collect sunlight energy and convert it into stored chemical energy. Decomposers are organisms that break down the remains of plants and animals and return those nutrients to the ecosystem. When they decompose, when they break down dead organisms, those nutrients are returned to the soil and then can be used by other producers, other plants that are growing in the area. Consumers are organisms that eat or consume other organisms, and there are different types of consumers. Herbivores, like the deer here, are organisms that eat only plants. Carnivores are organisms that eat only meat. Omnivores, like the bear and like humans, eat both plants and animals. And then scavengers, like this vulture, are organisms that feed on dead organisms. So that means if they stumbled upon an organism that had died naturally or been killed by a predator and part of the remains were left, a scavenger would come and feed on whatever was left. It wouldn't have to be a fresh kill. It could be many days old and they would still feed on it. Chemical energy is transferred from one organism to the next in a food chain. So we use a diagram like this to show that transfer of energy. The arrows in the diagram represent the flow of energy from one organism to the next. So at the bottom of the food chain is this corn. That's a producer. It doesn't feed on any other organisms. It grows and it converts sunlight into chemical energy. The primary consumer, the thing that feeds on the producer, is this grasshopper. Then the grasshopper is preyed upon by a lizard. That's called the secondary consumer because we have to go back 2 steps to find that original producer that gets its energy from the sun. The snake on the far right is the tertiary consumer. Tertiary means 3, so we're 3 steps away from the producer, the corn that converted sunlight into chemical energy. So as you move to the right here, as you follow the arrows, you get to more and more complex organisms. And they get farther and farther away from the initial producer. But if we go backwards along the food chain, we see that indirectly all energy comes from the sun because the snake feeds upon the lizard, which feeds upon the grasshopper, which got its energy from the corn, which got its energy from the sun. A food web looks different than a food chain because a food web is made up of many different food chains. You see here it's no longer a straight line, and it shows that all of the different organisms in this picture are connected. So in this picture, we can see multiple producers, the grass and the tree. We can see multiple consumers that are at different levels in the food chain. The grasshopper is a primary consumer, so is the rabbit. If we go farther up through the food web, we've got a fox, which is in this diagram a tertiary consumer. But they're all connected. We've got arrows showing connections between consumers and producers headed both directions. And actually, it's possible for an organism to be at a few different levels in the food web. All parts of the food web are connected. So here's a simple example. Here's a producer, the daisy plant. Then some organisms that feed on it are this insect, grasshopper, the caterpillar, and this grub. Then this mouse here feeds on the grub. It feeds on the caterpillar, feeds on the grasshopper. The mosquito in the middle here feeds on the mouse. It also feeds on that bird. And we've got some arrows here going both directions. That tells me that the bird might eat the mosquito, but the mosquito also feeds upon the bird. It will land on the bird and suck its blood. When you make your biome project, one of your slides will include a food web that you create. So you cannot find one on the internet and copy and paste it into your project. You need to include pictures of at least 8 different organisms in the following categories. You need 1 producer, 1 decomposer, 1 scavenger, 2 top predators, so they're at the top of the food chain. They're not preyed upon by anything else. And then you can choose 3 other organisms that fit into any one of those categories. So remember, your producer should be a plant. The decomposer is maybe a fungi or a bacteria that breaks down dead material in the environment. The scavenger is an organism that will eat a carcass, an organism that died of natural causes or was killed by something else, not necessarily recently. And then those 2 top predators. So to get going on this, you should first select an animal from your biome. Find out what it eats, and also find out what eats that animal. Then work out from that animal. Keep adding to your food chain to create a food web. Make sure that you've got 8 organisms that fit into these categories. Make sure that all of your organisms are connected. So every organism should have multiple arrows pointing to or away from it. Label each organism by its name and by its role in the food web. So an example would be wolf, that's the name of the organism, and carnivore, its role in the food web. Those are the notes, the seminar for Module D, Unit 1, Lesson 2, Roles in Energy Transfer.